The sharp thud of the shovel striking the earth shattered the stillness of the quiet morning. The peaceful hush of the cemetery was replaced by the rhythmic sound of digging. David stood over his mother's grave, the golden rays of early sunlight stretching long, eerie shadows across the land. His fingers clenched the wooden handle of the shovel, knuckles turning white, not from the crisp morning air, but from the overwhelming storm of emotions surging through him. For months, an unsettling feeling had gnawed at him, refusing to fade. His mother's sudden death, the hastily arranged funeral, and the way his father had barely met his gaze since then, it all felt wrong. Every fiber of his being screamed that something was off. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his bones. "I have to know," he muttered under his breath, his grip on the shovel tightening as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. His mother, Clara, had been the warmest, most compassionate soul he had ever known. She wasn't just a mother, she was his safe place, his guide, his everything. People like her didn't just vanish overnight. Yet in an instant she was gone. The doctors had labeled it a heart attack, but David refused to accept that. How could a woman so full of energy, so alive, just die without warning? It didn't make sense. It never had. And no matter how much everyone tried to convince him otherwise, he couldn't silence the doubt clawing at his mind. The grave was still fresh. The soil, dark and loose, crumbled beneath his efforts as he worked relentlessly. His muscles burned with exertion, but he barely noticed. Sweat trickled down his face, mingling with the hot tears he hadn't even realized he was shedding. He didn't care. Not about the whispers that would follow. Not about the town branding him insane. He needed answers. And he would dig until he got them. When the coffin finally came into view, David's heart slammed against his ribcage. He hesitated, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the wooden box that held the woman who had given him life. This is real. This is happening. For a moment he almost turned back, almost convinced himself to leave it alone. But then, memories flooded his mind. Her laughter, the way she would squeeze his hand reassuringly, the countless times she had told him to always trust his instincts. And so, for her, he pressed on. With a deep, shuddering breath, he wedged his fingers under the coffin lid and forced it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the eerie creak echoing through the empty graveyard like a scream. And then he saw her. His mother lay still, her once warm skin now cold and pale, just as he had last seen her at the funeral. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Her hands. They were clenched into tight fists. Her nails were broken, some ripped down to the skin. Dried blood stained her fingertips. Her lips were slightly parted, frozen mid-scream, as if she had been desperately trying to call out for help. David's vision blurred as he stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. And then, his eyes locked onto the inside of the coffin lid. Scratch marks. Long, jagged streaks carved into the wood, smeared with traces of blood. A chill unlike any other crawled up his spine, wrapping around his body like ice. His mother had not died of a heart attack. She had been buried alive. A choked gasp tore from his lips as his legs buckled, sending him crashing onto the damp grass. His mind spiraled, trying to comprehend the horror before him. The woman who had raised him, protected him, loved him, had spent her last moments trapped, alone, in suffocating darkness, clawing for a chance to live. Tears streamed down his face as he forced himself forward, his trembling fingers reaching for her cold, lifeless hand. "Mom?" "Oh, God, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice splintering into broken sobs. "I didn't know. I should have known. I should have saved you." But even in the depths of his grief, a fire ignited inside him, a blazing, all-consuming fury. This was not an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had made sure his mother never had a chance to escape. And David was going to find out who. With shaking hands, he yanked his phone from his pocket, barely able to hit the right buttons as he dialed for the police. The moment the operator picked up, her calm, professional voice sounded almost distant against the storm raging in his mind. "I need to report a crime," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "My mother, She was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery. You need to come.
Now.
His entire body was trembling, but his resolve was unshakable. He wouldn't let this go. He couldn't. As the distant wail of sirens pierced the early morning silence, dread pooled in his stomach. Who had done this? His father? The thought alone made bile rise in his throat. Mark had been distant since Clara's passing, avoiding David's eyes, speaking in clipped sentences, disappearing for hours without explanation. But could he really be capable of something this monstrous? And if not him, then who? The doctors? Had they misdiagnosed her? Or had they known exactly what they were doing? Before he could unravel the twisted possibilities, the red and blue flashes of police lights illuminated the cemetery, painting the gravestones in flickering, ghostly colors. David wiped his face, straightened his shoulders, and braced himself. The police would have questions. Questions he didn't have all the answers to yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Here's the paraphrased and expanded version of your script while keeping the same emotions and articulation style. A whisper escaped David's lips, barely audible. Yes, my mother, she was buried alive. I found her like this. Detective Harris turned her sharp gaze toward the coffin, her jaw tightening. A flicker of something, disbelief, shock, or maybe anger, crossed her face before she motioned for the forensic team to begin their work. Then, she turned back to David, her expression unreadable. This is a serious accusation. Her voice was firm but not unkind. Can you explain why you decided to dig up the grave? David inhaled deeply, trying to steady the tremor in his voice. She didn't just die. I knew something was wrong. His words came out in a rush, desperate, raw. The funeral was rushed. My father, he's been acting strange ever since. I couldn't just let it go. I had to know the truth. Detective Harris nodded slowly, jotting something down in her notepad. And your father? Where is he now? David swallowed hard. At home, I think. His voice barely rose above a whisper. He doesn't know I'm here. The detective studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. Then, without looking away, she lifted a hand and signaled to one of her officers. Bring the father in for questioning. And call the medical examiner. ASAP. We need to confirm what happened. As the officers moved quickly to carry out her orders, a wave of anxiety surged through David. His father would be furious when he found out what David had done. But at this point, he didn't care. Not after what he had uncovered. The forensic team worked carefully, documenting every horrifying detail, every scratch inside the coffin lid, every bloodied fingernail, every faint bruise on Clara's wrists. Evidence of a struggle. Proof that she had fought for her life. Asterisk, asterisk. Minutes later, the medical examiner arrived. He didn't need long to confirm what David had already known in his heart. Clara had been alive when they buried her. Detective Harris returned to David, her face set in a grim expression. This is now a homicide investigation. The words sent a shiver through him. Homicide. Murder. She continued, her voice unwavering. We need to speak with your father and anyone else who may have been involved in your mother's death. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm her? David hesitated. His father had always been a difficult man, cold, distant, unreadable, but violent. That was something else entirely. And yet, something about the way he had acted after Clara's death had always felt off. Like he had already moved on before the funeral was even over. And then there was Evelyn, his father's so-called family friend. David had suspected for years that she was more than that. His mother had, too. Could she have played a role in this? His mouth felt dry as he answered. I don't know for sure. His voice wavered, but he forced himself to go on. But my father, he wasn't exactly grieving when my mother died. And Evelyn, she's been around a lot. More than ever. I don't trust her. Detective Harris gave a short nod, making a note in her pad. We'll look into it. She met his eyes again, her expression unreadable. In the meantime, I need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. This isn't going to be easy, David. It's going to take time. Are you ready for that?